All right. Once again, a lot of sections, a lot of stuff. But this part 7 here is kind of, to me, like somewhat opposed to the rest of the book. I feel like there are parts of the book where Marx is very kind of slow and painstaking, and you're kind of like, get to the point, guy, come on. This is taking forever. But to me, this section, particularly chapter 25, feels like a little bit rushed, a little bit like covering major, big issues, big topics very quickly, and then moving on to the next topic, right? So it's, to me, like a really big shift in style and kind of and sort of the content, and it's kind of a lot. So we'll see what we make of it. And like I said before, like, you get, when you read all this, and it's so much stuff, and it's really rich and jumping from big topic to big topic, and then you get to section 5, the illustrations, you're just exhausted by that point. And I never seem to figure out how to sort of teach that section, so I don't have a lot to say about section 5, but we'll hopefully talk about it when we get to discussion. But okay, so part 7 is, again, like many of our sort of shifting to a new part of the book, it really does shift the analytical focus. David Harvey kind of talks like what Capital is really doing is kind of shifting the window through which you're like looking at capitalism, right? And each window is sort of related to other sort of ideas, but it's really kind of putting a border around what we're going to look at. But ultimately, as I've said over and over again, this book is about this. It's really, this is the main thing of this book. It's MCM prime. And we've spent much of the, it took us a while to get to MCM prime, but once we got there, we really just were trying to understand how is that M prime produced through the exploitation of labor. And there's absolute and there's relative and so forth. But now we're once again looking at the M prime, but we're going to look at it from a different standpoint. And very interestingly, if you notice, part 7 starts not with chapter 23, but with a weird little intro to the part. There is just like laying out some stuff, right? And one thing I think we have, the big question of this section is, what does, okay, the capitalist has produced the M prime, produced the surplus, but well, we know the workers have produced it actually. And the question is now, what do they do with that M prime? Like, where does it go next? That's the real question of part 7. What to do with the surplus? Now you have it, you're a capitalist, you've produced a surplus. Well, what do you do with it? And he says, the first condition of accumulation is that the capitalist must have contrived to sell the commodities and reconvert the capital of the money received from the sale. In the following pages, we shall assume capital passes through the process of circulation in the normal way. So, getting to M prime means you sold the commodities, right? It doesn't just mean you exploited the worker in production, it means you actually sold it. So he's saying, yeah, we assume that happened, right? And by the way, in volume 2, we kind of look into that whole process of selling and moving and circulating commodities. And this is the key. The capitalist who produces surplus value, who extracts unpaid labor directly from the workers and fixes it in the commodities, is admittedly the first appropriator of this surplus value, but he by no means is its ultimate proprietor. He has to share it afterwards with capitalists who fulfill other functions in social production taken as a whole, with the owner of the land, and with yet other people. Surplus value is therefore split up into various parts. Its fragments fall to various categories of persons and take on various mutually independent forms, such as profit, interest, gains made through trade, ground rent. We shall be able to deal with those in modified forms of surplus value only in volume 3. So again, I mentioned this the very first day of class. This book is actually a very narrow look at capitalism. Like, if you're interested in interest, which is pretty important, or rent, or what he says here, the gains made through trade in volume 3, that's called merchant's capital. All this stuff is not covered in volume 1. And all this stuff is really ultimately in volume 3, he covers it as the distribution of that M prime, of that surplus. That surplus is produced ultimately in the hidden abode of production. And then once it's produced, these other factors in society get to take their cut from that surplus value, and they drain it from the capitalist, right? And one he doesn't mention here, which he doesn't unfortunately get a much, because the book's called Capital. The other big thing here is the state, right? The state will take part of the surplus value as in the form of taxes, right? And that is all sort of from a political economy standpoint, that is what we call a distributional question. You produce the surplus, and then how is it distributed amongst these different social classes and social actors? And unfortunately, we're not covering that here, right? So ultimately what he says, blah, blah, blah. We're going to assume that the capitalist producer is the owner of the entire surplus value, okay? Or perhaps better, as the representative of all who share the booty with him. So he's just, in this book, we're just acting like, okay, we're only going to look at what the capitalist does with the surplus value. And again, like you said before, that's sort of the primary appropriator of that surplus value anyway, right? But then he says, key methodological thing. We therefore begin by considering accumulation from an abstract point of view, i.e. simply as one aspect of the immediate process of production. So again, I've come to think that when he says this abstract, what he means is like we're looking at it narrowly, and we're abstracting from all these other forces in society that would actually be part of this process, is distributing the surplus value, right? Or really, what to do with the surplus value. So again, it's kind of an important little 2-page intro to sort of lay the methodological parameters around what we're going to do. And what we're going to do is first look at something called simple reproduction. And simple reproduction is, can anyone tell me what, I'm sick of talking. Does anyone know what is simple reproduction?
MCM? No French?
That's a good way to look at it, actually. What it is, there is an M prime, but it's the question of what happens to it. What does the capitalist, in simple reproduction, what does the capitalist do with it?
Like immediately reinvested? Or opposite?
What else could he do with it?
Like buy stuff for himself.
Consume it,
yeah.
Right? So in simple reproduction, the entire, say they invest $10 into commodities, they come out with $15. That's a surplus value of $5. They take that entire $5 and they buy a couple Big Macs, right? And they eat them. Okay, so they consume it with, a capitalist that makes this surplus value can take that money and just buy yachts. They can buy mansions, they can buy commodities for their own pleasure, right? And so if they consume all of the M prime, that means, as Ellie just said, that means none is reinvested into the M, so that you're really just sort of reproducing the same amount of capital, like the same amount of machinery, same amount of raw material, same amount of labor is just being reproduced, because none of that M prime is being reinvested to expand the scale of operations by hiring more workers or building more factories or expanding the scale. So simple reproduction is really just exactly what it says. Like, it's just reproducing a kind of, you could call it like a stagnant level of production, because the capitalist just takes all the profit for their own individual consumption, right? And so this chapter really kind of, again, in a somewhat painstaking fashion, is trying to get us to think about like, okay, if we just look at what happens when the capitalist consumes all the M prime, all we have left is just the reproduction of this process of producing and workers coming back to work and capitalists coming, repurchasing the raw materials, and it's just reproducing the same thing at a certain scale of operations. And so he says, he starts to also sort of in this chapter sort of introduce the idea that, for much of this book, we've kind of been looking at a single capitalist and a single worker, and they kind of make this exchange, and then the capitalist kind of employs workers as individuals. But he starts to, in this chapter, introduce, like, we're also talking about reproducing a whole class system, right? So instead of taking a single capitalist and a single worker, we take the whole capitalist class and the whole working class. So if the capitalists are all consuming the entire surplus value, then they are going to reproduce their capital at the same scale, and workers as a whole class are going to reproduce their capacity to work by, consuming their means of subsistence and then coming back to work. And again, this whole thing is going to be kind of stagnantly reproducing itself in a class way. And he says later, if we contemplate not the single capitalist and the single worker, but the capitalist class and the working class, not an isolated process of production, but a capitalist production in full swing and on an actual social scale. So part 7, as we'll see, Marx really starts to think, this section really starts to get us to think about society as a whole, like how these processes sort of affect society as a whole on the actual social scale, and how it affects class relations at the actual level of society. And so there's a lot of really interesting, a lot of you have kind of delved into the concept of social reproduction and what it takes for workers to reproduce their lives outside of the workplace. Unfortunately, something Marx doesn't spend a ton of time on in this book, but there's stuff in this chapter that kind of hints at what this is about. One reason he doesn't spend much time because of this: the maintenance and reproduction of the working class remains a necessary condition for the reproduction of capital, but the capitalist may safely leave this to the workers' drives for self-preservation and propagation. So the capitalist doesn't need to care so much about why the worker keeps coming back to work every day. They just need to assume that if they pay them the value of labor power, they will continue to come back, right? One time, there's a lot of debates over, how do we think about the labor of humans who sell their labor power for a wage versus in capitalism versus the labor of like mules or other animals that are deployed by capitalists to, do work in a mine or do work on a field or something like that. And there's a Marxist here who's left us named Don Mitchell, and I was trying to think through, like, what are the differences there? And he just said it and is like, oh, this is what it is. Like, the human wage laborer takes charge of their own reproduction, right? That's very different than a horse that you actually have to maintain and feed and upkeep to keep that horse working, right? The capitalist must treat the horse almost like a machine that they have to put, oil into, and they have to feed the horse. But humans, they leave the workplace and their own drive for self-preservation kind of allows them to reproduce themselves outside the workplace. And that's a very particular thing about human labor power that's very different from other forms of even biological labor power in capitalism. He also says, in reality, the individual consumption of the worker is unproductive, right? So when the workers consume outside the workplace, that's not productive of surplus value. That's just something else. For it simply reproduces the needy individual. Really, working class reproduction or even capitalist consumption is just reproducing needs, right? And some capitalists have ridiculous needs, like for infinity pools or yachts or really like luxurious things, but they're ultimately just like needs, right? But from the standpoint of the working class, even when it stands outside the direct labor process, is just as much an appendage of capital as the lifeless instruments of labor are. Even its individual consumption with certain limits, a mere aspect in the process of capital's reproduction. So every time a working class person is consuming something, they're doing what we've talked about, like CMC, where they've exchanged their commodity labor power, they're getting money wages, and they're buying shoes and food and energy. But they're consuming, right? And they're sending money to other capitalists that are doing MCM prime, right? So they are a mere appendage to another process of capitalism, right? Or sorry, of capital that's happening behind their backs and is, and so for those, you know, I've been like banging the drum on in climate politics that all we talk about is people's consumption and how their consumption has a carbon footprint, and you know, all, you know, we can measure. And a lot of the sort of left discourse on climate change, you know, says, you know, we have real climate carbon inequality, and they too only focus on the rich people's consumption, right? They buy yachts, they eat a lot of meat, they drive SUVs, and it doesn't ever point out what Marx teaches us here, which is that even the rich consumer is doing CMC for some other capitalist, right? When they buy a big SUV, they're actually still sending money to a big you know, Ford Auto Capital Company, and they're sending oil money to Exxon, and so any consumer in this simple reproduction is sending money to another capitalist who's accumulating. Well, actually, we're in simple reproduction, so who's taking that profit, right, to kind of do something else with it. So any consumer in capitalism is an appendage to a larger process of capital, right, that is going on. And it's quite stunning how climate politics is just erases the role of owners of capital in responsibility. It's all about your consumption-based footprints. So anyway, that's my little hobby horse. And here, another classic case. This is just broken record for me, but the Roman, and for Marx for that matter, the Roman slave was held by chains. The wage laborer is bound to its owner by invisible threads, right? So this form of domination is more abstract, and as we'll learn a lot in the next book, is a kind of the form of domination is what he in part 8 calls the silent compulsion of economic relations, or the mute compulsion, or there's another translation, my favorite, is the dull compulsion of economic relations. This sort of like feeling like, you know, if you don't get this money, you're not going to survive, but it's not the same as being chained to enslaved by the Romans, right? It's a very different form of domination. It's domination by the market and this relation to money, right? And this reproduction is a kind of domination, rooted in these ideas of, again, fair exchange and legal contracts between employers and employees. Yep. So this is the grand crescendo ending of simple reproduction chapter. The capitalist process of production, therefore, is seen as a total connected process, i.e. the process of reproduction produces not only commodities, not only surplus value, but it also produces and reproduces the capital relation itself. On the one hand, capitalist, and on the other hand, wage laborer. So this is, I think, you know, a good point for Marx to talk about how, you know, the production of surplus value is producing a relationship, right? So if you go back the first day, I told you that this is what the book is about, right? And one way of thinking about what this is it's a process of money creating more money, right? And then, as we'll learn, reinvesting that money to grow. But it's also, capital is also seen as a relation, right? It's a relation between a particular type of social relationship of private capitalist owners and laborers who own nothing but their labor power to sell for a wage, right? And it's that specific social relation that has to be reproduced on a larger and larger scale as capitalism develops. And again, as Ernest Mandel said on the very first page of the introduction, like Marx wrote this, where it was first published, where capitalist industry, though predominant in a few Western European countries, still appeared as an isolated island encircled by a sea of independent farmers and handicrafts people, which covered the whole world, including even the greater part of Europe. So Marx is writing this with this relation between capitalist and wage worker is still not really the overwhelming relation that structures production, even in Europe, right? So in many ways, that's why this book was really more prescient of what's to come, as opposed to analyzing what was actually happening in his time, right? Okay. Chapter 24. Straight off the bat. Earlier, we considered how surplus value arises from capital. Now we have to see how capital arises from surplus value. The employment of surplus value as capital, or the reconversion into capital, is called accumulation of capital. So let me go back. I should have put another slide. So again, simple reproduction is the capitalist consumes all the surplus value for their own delights. Accumulation is when they take the surplus value and reinvest it into growing or accumulating the scale of operations. So hiring more workers, building more technologies, building more factories, whatever. And so that's what accumulation is, taking that surplus value and reinvesting it. So the first section of this is called capitalist production on a progressively increasing scale. So again, simple reproduction is not increasing the scale, it's just reproducing the same scale. Now we're talking about it's getting bigger and bigger. And he has a wonderful, let me read. And then he gets into the inversion, which converts property laws of commodity production into laws of capitalist appropriation. This again, talking about, hey, it's weird, like fair exchange is supposed to be about equality, but all of a sudden capital keeps getting this extra amount that they keep even sort of piling up on each other, right? And this sort of violates the laws of equality of exchange that he's been talking about but there's a great metaphor here for what does accumulation look like. It looks like concretely accumulation can be resolved into the production of capital on a progressively increasing scale. The cycle of simple reproduction alters its form, and to use Sismondi's expression, changes into a spiral. Last time I taught this book in 2020, this book on the left didn't exist, and therefore this lovely graphic didn't exist. And I had to draw this spiral, and I had this little like piece of paper that I took a very dimly lit picture of the spiral. But now she has this wonderful spiral she made. So I'm happy to be able to share this spiral. But as you can see, MCM prime 1, then you reinvest it into MC prime, into M prime 2, and it goes. And the spiral is to give you a sense that at each level, the scale of operations is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's what accumulation of capital is all about. Section 2, there's really not a whole lot to say about this other than what it says. The political economist's erroneous conception of reproduction on increasing scale. He has this sort of nitpicking thing with the political economists say that all the new capital is sort of reinvested into productive laborers. So it all goes to kind of wages and workers, where Marx is trying to point out that no, a lot of it's going to what he would call constant capital, right? And a lot of the accumulation of capital is reinvesting it not in new workers, but into new machinery and new technology and new kind of factories and larger scales of operation. Then we get into section 3, the division of surplus value into capital in revenue, the abstinence theory. So again, we're back here. Now we have a question of like, okay, we have these two ways of thinking about how this M prime is used. Revenue is what is used to consume for the private capitalist, right? So another way you could look at it is like if a capitalist is running their enterprise, they might actually pay themselves an income, right? And that would come out of the surplus value. Like I make famously, like apparently like Jeff Bezos' salary is like 80,000 a year, and he's all like, look how great I am, I only make 80,000 a year if you don't look at my wealth and stock options over here. And but like, you know, so like the revenue is what they get as a salary, and they then take that salary and they consume yachts and mansions and infinity pools and whatever. And that's revenue. And then we divide revenue into capital. So the division of surplus value into capital and revenue. The capital is the part that's accumulated and reinvested in the process, right? So should be clear by now what that's all about. And this section is really about what proportion should the capitalists divide, how much should they consume, how much should they accumulate. And of course, there's sort of this religious doctrine that the good capitalist is going to accumulate. That is like Moses to the prophets, right? Industry furnishes the material which savings accumulates, therefore save, and reconvert the greatest possible portion of surplus value or surplus product into capital. Accumulation for the sake of accumulation, production for the sake of production. And he gets into this sort of abstinence theory that political economists try to celebrate these capitalists because they abstain, like this, like just as I was saying, like Jeff Bezos, like, look, I pay myself so little because I'm building this wonderful world-changing company called Amazon. I'm taking all this surplus value and plowing it back into data centers and streaming and horrible like dystopian warehouses and whatever. Like that's what I'm doing with all this money, right? I'm not just even though consuming it. And so Marx kind of makes fun of this whole abstinence theory and shows that, as capital accumulates, even if you're only consuming, say, 10% of the whole surplus value, that's like billions of dollars. So it's not so impressive if you're being abstinent, right? But I think ultimately the main point of this section is that there is a compulsion that the capitalists don't really control from competition that actually does force the capitalists to have to accumulate a good portion of that surplus value, because if they are just wasting away and consuming the surplus value and other capitalists are accumulating, they're going to lose out in the game of competition, right? I think in my 273 class, I say that like, what was happening in 2020 to Skype, Skype like had the whole market cornered for themselves and everyone talked about let's Skype tomorrow, like that we're all going to Skype, right? And then all of a sudden Zoom comes along and they've just like changed the whole world of video chat. Now everyone doesn't even know what Skype is, right? And so perhaps Skype was not accumulating. Perhaps they were getting a little fat and happy on their surplus value and kind of just consuming it and like building yachts and infinity pools. And then all Zoom comes along and Skype is no more, right? So you can never get too comfortable, right? In capitalism, you must accumulate. Okay, so that's the abstinence theory. This is actually 742. I have to just point out that as he kind of is talking about, there's this drive for capitalists to accumulate. He starts to give us little hints of how again, this drive under capitalism is really laying the conditions for a higher mode of production. Except as capital personified, the capitalist has no historical value and no right to his historical existence, which, to use Winchnowski's amusing expression, ain't got no date. It is only to this extent that the necessity of capitalists' own transitory existence is implied in the transitory necessity of the capitalist mode of production. So again, I've been hammering this. I think this book is really about Marx's theory of how capitalism is a transitory mode of production that lays the conditions for something better. But insofar as he is capital personified, its motivating force is not the acquisition and enjoyment of use values, right? Not consuming infinity pools, but the acquisition and augmentation of exchange values. They are fanatically intent on the valorization of value. Consequently, they ruthlessly forces the human race to produce for production's sake. In this way, they spur on the development of society's productive forces and the creation of those material conditions of production, which alone can form the real basis of a higher form of society, a society in which the full and free development of every individual forms the ruling principle. So again, he's telling us that the way in which capital develops the productive forces, socializes production, creates really the conditions necessary for kind of a higher level of freedom for all, right? And for those that equate Marxism with kind of this like top-down state domination, like collectivism over the individual, it's quite interesting when Marx writes politically. It's very clear that like individual freedom is like his most important principle. Like he's this sounds scandalous, but he's very influenced by liberalism and like this emancipation of the individual that liberalism promises, and he thinks it's a false promise under sort of liberal capitalism because people are so dominated under this economic system that to really like consummate individual freedom, we need to actually take collective social control over the economic system, right? And ultimately, I think this sort of passage is saying that like capitalism develops productive forces so that there would be such productive capacity that we could have free time to develop ourselves as individuals, to have free time. Again, I mentioned this before, to fish in the morning and hunt in the afternoon and philosophize at dinner. And, it's that notion of freedom as free time is an individual development. And it's not like we're all going to be isolated monks, right? But that ultimately human creativity can be developed in this kind of free way only through the time to develop oneself in their own capacities, right? So that's quite an interesting passage. All right, so that is section 3. Section 4 is called the circumstances which, independently of the proportional division of surplus value into capital and revenue, determine the extent of accumulation, namely the degree of exploitation of labor power, the productivity of labor, the growing difference in amount between capital employed and capital consumed, and the magnitude of the capital advanced. So I actually think he says a lot of things in those, 11 pages, but he sums them up beautifully at the very start of section 5. So he says, it has been shown in the course of this inquiry that capital is not a fixed magnitude, but a part of social wealth which is elastic and constantly fluctuates with the division of surplus value into revenue and additional capital. And here I think is what section 4 is about. It has been seen further that even with a given magnitude of functioning capital, the labor power, science, and land, which means economically speaking all the objects of labor furnished by nature without human intervention, incorporated in it form elastic powers of capital, allowing it within certain limits a field of action independent of its own magnitude. So the section really is talking about how this process of accumulation gets to sort of ratchet up and harness these powers of productivity and science that sort of get accumulated onto capital, and then society itself sort of acts as if, again, like science and progress and innovation, it's all attribute of capital, because capital keeps sort of accumulating these free gifts of the productivity of social labor and is able to kind of accumulate those gifts onto more and more capital, right? That gets harnessed as an attribute of capital. So then he gets into, again, one of his little nitpicky things with the political economist about the labor fund. And the labor fund basically says that the political economists have this dogma that there's a fixed amount of capital that they can accumulate, and that actually means there's also a fixed amount that would go to the workers, or what he calls variable capital, and that fixed amount is called the labor fund. And he says it was used by Bentham. By the way, in these passages, if you read the footnotes, he's just burning on Bentham, just vicious attacks, on Bentham for being, this ridiculous bourgeois loser. For apologetic purposes in particular, so as to respect one part of capital, namely variable capital, or that part convertible into labor power as being a fixed size, right? Variable capital in its material existence, the mass of the means of subsistence it represents for the worker, or the so-called labor fund, was turned by this fable into a separate part of social wealth, confined by natural chains and unable to cross the boundary into other parts. So again, he's trying to say that political economy kind of makes up this idea that there's just this fixed amount that goes to labor and it can't be augmented through, let's say, struggle or demands that say we deserve a certain wider share of distribution to variable capital. The facts on which this dogma is based are these. On the one hand, the worker has no right to interfere in the division of social wealth into means of enjoyment for the non-worker and means of production. And again, the capitalist wants to maintain full dictatorial control over what to do with this surplus value. It doesn't want to say that, some of that surplus value came from us and you should give it back to us, right? That's not That's violating the laws of private property as they've been established under the system. On the other hand, it is only favorable in exceptional cases that he can enlarge the so-called labor fund at the expense of the revenue of the rich, right? So it's sort of quarantining the labor fund as this fixed amount that can't be augmented. We first add together the individual wages actually paid, and then we assert that the sum thus obtained from the total value of the labor fund is handed down by the grace of God and nature. So again, Marx is trying to kind of talk about how these categories become naturalized and frozen and not subject to politics or struggle or any kind of contestation over this. All right, finally, chapter 25. I'm always, every time I read this book, I get astonished by the opening line of this chapter, which is, in this chapter, we shall consider the influence of the growth of capital on the fate of the working class. Just like, damn, boom, right? And it's just like a big sort of mission of this chapter, the fate of the working class, right? Okay, so, but unfortunately, then he immediately goes into very technical and mathematical formulations, which are less exciting than the fate of the working class. And that formulation is something we need to talk about, which is called the organic composition of capital, which, sorry, you can't really, you can see it, sort of. The short story is that the organic composition of capital is simply C over V, constant capital over a ratio, right? How much capital is going into constant capital over, in a fraction, how much is going into the variable capital, right? And so, but Marx being Marx, he has to sort of say the composition of capital is to be understood in a twofold sense, right? As value is determined by the proportion of which is divided into constant capital, or the value of the means of production, and variable capital, or the value of labor power, the sum of total wages. But on the other hand, as material, as it functions in the lived real world of the process of production, all capital is divided into means of production and living labor power. This latter composition is determined by the relation between the mass of the means of production employed on the one hand, and the mass of labor necessary for their employment on the other. I call the former the value composition, which technically what I said is the short story. C over V are value terms, right? But the latter is the technical composition of capital. So instead of C over V, that's like MP over LP, right? Means of production over labor power. So instead of like $100 in machinery costs and raw materials over $50 in wage cost, you're putting like, you know, like the physical amounts of means of production and raw materials, you know, 10 tons of coal, 30 steam engines, over a fraction that would be like 3,300 living workers, right? So then he goes, there's a close correlation between these two. To express this, I call the value composition of capital, insofar as it's determined by the technical composition and mirrors the changes in the latter, the organic composition of capital. Wherever I refer to the composition of capital without further qualification, it's the organic composition, is always understood. So ultimately, unfortunately, I never know how to get rid of this, but remember our little concrete world of real life, abstract world of money value. Here we have a similar formulation. In the concrete world, you have the technical composition, again, means of production over living labor. In the abstract world, we have the value composition, constant over variable. But he does a little dialectical synthesis here, merging these worlds to call it the organic composition. He claims they mirror each other anyway. But then he does another interesting thing. He says the many individual capitals invested in a particular branch of production have compositions which differ from each other to a greater or lesser extent. The average of their individual compositions gives us the compositions of the total capital in the branch of production under consideration. So think of something like the steel industry. You could look at all the different steel capitalist firms and look at well, what's the composition of each and every firm? And you would get C over V for each one, and then you'd average them all together and get the C over V average of the whole sector of steel production, right? But then he says, finally, the average of all the average compositions in all branches of production gives us the composition of the total social capital of a country. And it is with this alone that we are concerned here in the final analysis. That's another like, whoa, okay. So now we're looking at countries. We're looking at like all of society and the composition of capital at a societal level, not even a particular branch of industry, but the whole society, right? So that's, he just throws that in there. And then so we have to, as we move on, we need to understand that we're talking more at, again, the social scale, not just a one enterprise anymore. Now, section 1 of chapter 25 is called Growing Demand for Labor Power Accompanies the Accumulation if the composition of capital remains the same. So if C over V is the same, then as you accumulate capital, you are gonna reinvest that M prime into more V, right? Because the ratio is remaining the same. So it's gonna lead to more variable capital required as you accumulate capital, because as you're growing, you need more workers. So he has this way of formulating this, that accumulation of capital is therefore the multiplication of the proletariat, right? So it's again, we're long distance away from simple reproduction. Now we're talking about not just reproducing the working class, but growing the working class, growing its extent, multiplying it. And isn't it crazy that in this book, it's not till page 764 that Marx decides to define the proletariat, which is perhaps like his most cherished concept. And he says, proletarian must be understood to mean, economically speaking, nothing other than wage laborer, the person who produces and valorizes capital and is thrown into the street as soon as it becomes superfluous to the need of the valorization possessed by Monsieur Capital, as Picure calls this person. Then he quotes someone else. The sickly proletarian of the primitive forest is a pretty Rauscherian fancy. The primitive forester is the owner of the primitive forest, and uses it as his property, meeting as few obstacles to this as an orangutan. So what he's saying here is that, you know, some people call proletarian, for some people just means sort of like poor, wretched folk that are struggling to survive. But if those poor, wretched folk are actually like live in the forest and own the forest and can produce their own subsistence from the forest, they're not proletarians. Proletarians are separated from the means of production, separated from the means of subsistence, and have no way to survive outside selling themselves to capital, right? So he's trying to really, as he says, this primitive forester, not a proletarian. They would only be the case if the primitive forest exploited them instead of being exploited by. As far as their health is concerned, such a person would well bear comparison not only with the modern proletarian, but also with the Sophitic and scrofulous quality. I don't know. Jeez. However, here William Rusher no doubt means his naive health of Lumberg when he talks of the primitive forest. I'm not sure. That's some sort of German internal battles that he's getting into there. But this is a pretty important passage for me, because one thing, again, in my work on ecological stuff, I've been trying to really emphasize that Marx's definition of the working class and Marx's understanding of the proletariat is fundamentally ecological. It's about separating the workers from the means of reproducing themselves from nature, right? So for most of human history, all producers had some connection to the land, and they produced their livelihood through the land and through the connection to ecology. And what makes the proletariat is that they are separated from, and that's actually what we get into in part 8, right? It's that you have to separate that population from the land, from ecology, and so and it's that separation from ecology that forces the working class under capitalism to have to survive via the market, right? They have to survive by selling themselves in the market to get a wage so that they can buy the things they need in the market. And it creates this kind of market dependence that is new, right? Again, even peasants were not really dependent as much on the market. They produced a lot of what they needed themselves, right? So this is very new. And again, he tells us what the proletariat is on page 764. But again, there's some point, I should have got the passage, but at some point in this section, he mentions, I think that like in Europe or something, around 25% of the population are wage laborers or proletariat or something like that. So we need to think about, again, how since Marx wrote this, what we've actually seen is the increasing multiplication of the proletariat on a global scale. We've seen the widespread proletarianization of much of the planet, you know, at a much larger scale than what Marx even experienced in his own life. So this is a famous article that talks about, since World War II, there's just been this slow process of de-peasantization where people that had connection to the land and subsistence have been forcibly removed from the land and forced to become landless proletarians. And what do then? They often move to cities and seek out employment or eke out a living in this kind of informal economy and in cities that often don't have a lot of jobs, right? So that is, this process of proletarianization is really scaled up in the 20th century. And then you start thinking about, we could also include the kind of slow, steady transition to capitalism in the former Soviet Union. And really, if we talk about China post-1978, we're talking about a huge proletarianization of the Chinese population over the last 40 years. Oh, that could have been bad. And the International Labor Organization estimated that the global wage force, the proletariat, has expanded about over 1 billion people in the last 40 years. And that's very outdated, right? This is kind of leading up to the crisis of 2008. But that's in fact what Marx said would happen, which is as capital accumulates, the proletariat multiplies. And we've seen the multiplication of the proletariat on a global scale. And by the way, it's like in China, like what happened was basically the market reforms made it so people couldn't live anymore in the countryside. And you had a massive process of what we're going to talk about, primitive accumulation, where people were forced to migrate from the countryside to seek out wage labor in cities and industrial areas in China, much of which look very similar to the types of conditions that we read about in the chapter on the working day or machinery or whatever. Okay, moving on. He starts to lay out a kind of theory of wages here, even though wages is part 6. He says that, to put it mathematically, the rate of accumulation is the independent, not the dependent variable. The rate of wages is the dependent, not the independent variable. So Marx has a kind of, I guess you could call it, accumulation theory of wages, right? That as accumulation starts to heat up, then wages can definitely rise with that accumulation, right? But as accumulation slows down, and there's a lot in this section about stuff he covered in chapter 15 about like the trade cycle and like periods of boom and bust and stagnation and so forth, and that's really what drives the level of wages. And he has this great line about that. If the quantity of unpaid labor supplied by the working class and accumulated by the capitalist class increases so rapidly that its transformation into capital requires an extraordinary addition of paid labor, then wages rise, and all other circumstances remaining equal, the unpaid labor diminishes in proportion. So if accumulation gets so high, capital can afford to raise wages. This is kind of, a lot of people talk about the golden age of capitalism is in post-World War II era, where wages actually rose with productivity and everyone was happy. But profits were really high then too. Like accumulation was booming, like everyone's just rebuilding the whole war-torn economy. But as soon as that diminution touches the point at which the surplus labor that nourishes capital is no longer supplied in normal quantity, a reaction sets in. A smaller part of the revenue is capitalized, accumulation slows down, and the rising movement of wages comes up against an obstacle. The rise of wages is therefore confined within limits that not only leave intact the foundations of the capital system, but also secure its reproduction on an increasing scale. So I think, I think he's describing something that would happen about 100 years after he lived, which is that, again, profits were so high, accumulation was so high in this sort of golden age of capitalism that capital could afford to share their profits with higher wages for unionized workers. And then what happened in this period is the profit rate went down. There was, in the 1970s, a big decline in profitability of capital, and what some people call the kind of profit squeeze, where capitalists weren't making profits. Also from competition between new entrants into the world economy, like from Germany and Japan, and then the reaction sets in, right? And in the 1970s, you get the capitalist class really organizes to really suppress down the wages of the working class, and just to keep their levels of expected accumulation where they expect them to be, right? And so that reaction sets in, and the working class organization, like the unions and stuff, are crushed to basically make possible the basis of the whole system, which is the accumulation of capital, right? Because if the unions and the working class kept their power, then perhaps they would have pushed wages so high that no imprime was even happening, right? And so the reaction had to set in. Okay, where are we? I think we're now into section 2, a relative diminution of the variable part. Variable part of capital occurs in the course of the further progress of accumulation and the concentration accompanying it. So again, section 1, he says, what if the composition of capital is kept static or the same? Now we're going to relax that and see what happens. And he says, so far we've considered only one special phase of the process. That is, the increase of capital occurs while the technical composition of capital remains constant. I have no idea why it says technical there instead of organic or value. I mean, whatever. But the process goes beyond this phase. Given the general basis of the capitalist system, a point is reached in the course of accumulation at which the development of the productivity of social labor becomes the most powerful lever of accumulation. So this is kind of getting into relative surplus value, right? Sooner or later, capitalists are going to realize the best way to make profits is to actually develop the productivity of labor. So make it more efficient, divide the labor, subdivide, division of labor, cooperation, and obviously machinery and technology, automation, all the stuff, right? Becomes a lever of accumulation. And so therefore, as we learned in part 4, if this is the most powerful lever, that means that capital is going to start reinvesting more of that imprime, not into V, but into C, right? So the C part is going to start getting larger in proportion to the V part, and the V part therefore undergoes a relative diminution. Now he's very clear that if accumulation is so high, a relative diminution might mean that the absolute amount of workers is growing, but it's just that proportionally to the C, it's becoming smaller, right? And ultimately, that means that as accumulation happens, the scale of operations of each individual capital grows, and they start to get bigger and bigger, and they start to concentrate capital on top of itself. So we're going to talk about the concentration and the centralization of capital. The concentration of capital is really, he's talking about as individual capitalist enterprises grow and reinvest their capital, they get bigger and bigger and bigger as individual capitals. That's concentration. It's more thinking about a single firm accumulating, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Every individual capital is larger or smaller concentration of means of production with corresponding command over a larger and smaller army of workers. Every accumulation begins with a new accumulation. And with the increasing mass of wealth presents itself on the one hand an increasing concentration of the means of production and of the command over labor, and on the other, as a repulsion of many individual capitals from one another. So he says as capitals start to grow and concentrate, they also start to subdivide and start to subcontract out stuff, right? And I think this is useful for, because many people only talk about the concentration of capital, but the repulsion of capital, the fact that if capitalists are really trying to be more productive and more efficient, they might decide that actually what they want to do is contract out a bunch of work to more specialist firms that can do things more efficiently. And that's actually what happened in the post sort of neoliberal world capitalist economy. You found what we now talk about as like global supply chains and logistics. Firms decided that they could be much more profitable if they just sort of subcontracted out production of all the different parts of the iPhone and all different parts of the car to different specialty corporations that could do that one thing really, really well. So the repulsion of capitals as they concentrate, they concentrate, then they go out, right? That's something that often doesn't get talked about from this section. But then we need to talk about the centralization of capital. And that's about how as capitals get bigger, they start to merge and buy up other capitals, right? And they start to, become centralized, right? So this is more about, many capitals forming into one capital. Capital grows to a huge mass in a single hand in one place because it has been lost by many in another place. So a capital buys out another company and does, absorbs it into its own operations. This is centralization proper. That's, I think it's funny, it doesn't often say proper, as distinct from accumulation and concentration. The laws of this centralization of capital or of the attraction of capital by capital cannot be developed here. Sad face. Again, something super important about sort of centralization of capital and monopolization. He's just like, it's not going to be developed here. Why is it not going to be developed here? Well, let's not forget, this is his plan for the volume of capital. He only really finished this one, right? Volume 2 is circulation. Volume 3 is, it's not just profit and interest, it's more, but he was also going to do a volume on competition, and that's what I think, that's where this would come, right? And also it might come in credit, because here he says down here that this process of centralizing capitals, it happens through the credit system. So people take out massive loans to buy up another company, and then they, do what's called a leveraged buyout or something. That's literally, leveraged buyout is literally like using debt to buy out other companies, right? So the credit system becomes a way through which this centralizes capital. And by the way, again, he's saying that this process is laying the conditions for the good stuff, right? Everywhere the increased scale of industrial establishments is the starting point for a more comprehensive organization of the collective labor of many people, for a broader development of their material forces, i.e. for a progressive transformation of isolated processes of production carried out by customary methods into socially combined and scientifically arranged processes of production. And I think he says in this section, like, sooner or later, you could just all concentrate and centralize into one single capitalist. And that's actually happening in our society. That's called Amazon. They're trying to like make the whole economy run through this one single capitalist named Jeff Bezos. But again, as we'll get into next time, this process of centralization creates a situation where now suddenly the working class has to just set its sights on this one mega capitalist, right? It's just sort of laid out for them. They're the ones they need to fight and overcome if they want to build another society. All right, now we get to section 3, the progressive production of a relative surplus population, or the industrial reserve army. This is going way too long, as usual. Oh, right. Sorry. So one interesting thing here is his theory of relative surplus population is actually a long form attack on Malthus and sort of like naturalistic theories of population that these political economists who well, first of all, Malthus, of course, theorized that the population is grows at a certain exponential rate, and the amount that land and food can give you is a linear rate, and sooner or later the population is going to outstrip the land, and we're all going to die a fiery death. And this is this sort of like naturalistic theory of population that he's attacking, but he's also in this section covering the political economist sort of theory that like, oh, if capitalists need more workers, then the people just sort of procreate to have more population to take advantage of those high workers, and there's this sort of weird economistic relationship between population and the labor market, right? And he's really attacking that too, because of course it's ridiculous, because what he's trying to say is like accumulation is like a quarterly like boom and bust, and things are flinging upwards and downwards, and population reproduction is a thing that takes generations. You can't just respond to the market, because you have to raise a child for in these days I guess like 12 years. But so he's trying to develop what is the theory of population that's specific to capitalism, and that's what this section is about. And he says, this is the law of, right at the bottom of this page, this is the law of population peculiar to the capitalist mode of production. And in fact, every particular historical mode of production has its own special laws of population, which are historically valid within that particular sphere. An abstract law of population exists only for plants and animals. And I think Malthus had this kind of like very abstract law that like humans are just like, they'll just overwhelm their resource base like any other species, and it's just going to be this thing that happens no matter what society you're in. And even though then only in absence of any historical intervention by man. But if a surplus population of workers is a necessary product of the accumulation of the development of wealth on a capitalist basis, this surplus population also becomes, conversely, the lever of capitalist accumulation. Indeed, it becomes a condition for the existence of the capitalist mode of production. It forms a disposable industrial reserve army, which belongs to capital just as absolutely as the latter had bred it at his own cost, independently of the limits of the actual increase of population. So regardless of what's happening biologically with the people, it creates a mass of human material, always ready for exploitation by capital, and in the interest of capital's own changing valorization requirements. So this theory that there has to be this kind of surplus population that sort of ebbs and flows with accumulation is something specific to this weird anarchic market organized capitalist system driven by profits, that you have to have this kind of layer of workers always kind of laying around to be gobbled up when times are good. And then you need to be able to throw those workers into the surplus pool when crisis hits. And this kind of ebb and flow of this reserve army is kind of what underpins the booms and busts of accumulation. It underpins where wages are and so forth. So he says, like I just said, the general movement of wages are exclusively regulated by the expansion and contraction of the industrial reserve army, right? And this in turn corresponds to the periodic alternations of the industrial cycle. They are not therefore determined by the variations of the absolute numbers of the working population, but by the varying proportions in which the working class is divided into an active army and a reserve army, by the increase or diminution in the relative amount of surplus population, by the extent to which an alternately absorbed and set free. What do we hear after COVID about wages and the labor market?
Unemployment hit like the highest it had been, I think.
God, it was so high for a little bit there.
I don't know, was it like since 2008 or before that?
I think it got even higher briefly, but
That's right.
but then once COVID ended, you know, all you heard about was, you know, we can't get, no one wants to work, you know, there's, you know, we can't get people to work. And, but what was, you know, there's a very sort of depressing theory about this, is that a lot of the working class died in the COVID, and therefore a lot of those workers were not coming back to work. But also there was weird sort of, you know, I think a lot of the way in which we think about this today is that a lot of the surplus populations are coming through migrant flows in the global kind of, and actually, if you read this carefully, like the depopulation of Ireland is really about migrant flows so that they become surplus populations elsewhere. And so, you know, another thing COVID did was sort of cut off, the closed all borders and so forth. So that there became a, you know, whether through death or closed borders, there became a just cutting off of the kind of surplus population flows, right? And so and so I do think like this theory is really relevant to what we're talking about today. He says the industrial reserve army during the periods of stagnation and average prosperity weighs down the active army of workers. During the periods of overproduction and feverish activity, it puts a curb on their pretensions. So even if times are good and workers are organized and saying, we want X, Y, Z, the capitalists, if there's a big reserve army, they can always say, well, yeah, we'll just replace you, right? Look at those poor wretched souls out there in the street. They'll take your job, right? This is the relative surplus population is therefore the background against which the law of demand and supply of labor does its work. It confines the field of action of this law to the limits absolutely convenient to capital's drive to exploit and dominate the workers. Okay. This is more of the same. I gotta move on. This is taking forever. But this is on 793. He talks about how capital is able to, you know, work both sides at once. And here at the bottom, he says that even as soon as the workers set up their own trade unions, right? As soon as they organize, plan cooperation between the employed and the unemployed in order to obviate or to weaken the ruinous effect of the natural law of capitalist production on their class, so soon does capital and its sycophant political economy cry out an infringement on the sacred laws of supply and demand. You hear this all the time from anti-worker political economy that says like trade unions are somehow like illegal monopolies on the price of labor, and they're kind of like distorting the labor market by their power, by their control over the price, and we should just let the price be dictated by the market, right? So and ultimately, if you want to crush worker organization, again, the existence of a huge surplus of labor that can replace them is a very good way to do that. Okay. Then he lays out different forms of existence of the relative surplus value, relative surplus population, and by the way, the general law of capitalist accumulation. So quickly, he has different categories. The floating are people moving from one job to another. This is just what economists call like the natural rate of unemployment. You always have churn where people are kind of moving from one industry to another. And because this capitalist system is always going through booms and busts, there's always just a churn of people needed to come into a sector and out of a sector and so forth. The latent, if I recall, he ultimately, a lot of what, particularly in section 5 on the illustration, it's really about how accumulation and concentration in agriculture leads to a massive labor productivity increase in agriculture, which sets free all these agricultural laborers for they're thrown into the proletariat, and they have to ultimately migrate to the towns, right, to find jobs in factories and things like this. But the latent population are the ones that don't want to migrate, right? They stick around. And this is, I think, really, you go to any small town in New York State today, and you see a lot of people that are not doing really well, right? It's, you know, like rural areas that have been devastated by capital flight and economic dislocation. You know, they still have people there because a lot of people like where they live in their home, that city and town. And so again, he calls this the latent population of just the surplus of people that are sticking around these rural areas where productivity has increased so much that they're not needed, but they can be deployed when needed in these areas. And if you read section 5, like if you read about the gang system, like crazy stuff. I mean, I think that was more for like prison and convict labor, but if you have all these people hanging around, maybe they were deployed in these gangs as well. Finally, the stagnant. This seems to be the people that are really what we now call kind of low wage workers who are you know, forced to, they're underemployed, right? They're like, they can only get part-time employment, but they want full-time, or they have to piece together like 2 or 3 part-time jobs to kind of piece together a sort of living. And they're sort of the sort of lower level of this surplus population that are like partially employed, really stagnant and very poor and so forth. And then he does talk about, well, there's also all these bottom layers, and he even says, not, this isn't including what he calls the lumpen proletariat, which are you know, the whatever vagabonds and criminals and whatever, and I guess homeless and people like this. But then he says there's 3 categories of these other people, like orphans and paupers and so forth, sickly, ragged proletariat, all this kind of stuff. This is quite striking. Pauperism is the hospital of the active labor army and the dead weight of the industrial reserve army. So it's this kind of purgatory between these 2 worlds. Along with the surplus population, pauperism forms a condition of capitalist production. So insofar as capitalism needs a surplus population, it needs pauperism, right? And that's kind of a brutal thing he's trying to say here, is that capitalism needs to have a certain portion of society that's destitute and miserable, and therefore forms a basis through which the labor market and accumulation can kind of work through. And I have to say, if you get a chance, I was listening to this story, making breakfast Saturday morning and like crying. It's just unbelievable that in Philadelphia right now, they have no resources for these areas that are dying. People just dropping dead on the streets because of this opioid, fentanyl mixed with horse tranquilizer. They call it tranq. And they talk to everyone, and they're just like, yeah, people just drop dead on the streets all the time. No one does anything. No one does a damn thing. They talk to the police, and the police say, we just don't have the resources to actually deal with these areas. That's what they said. And so there's just like total social abandonment of these neighborhoods, of these areas. And it's just heartbreaking. And again, shows that this existence of just utter destitution and poverty still is a sort of necessary part of this capitalist mode of production. It's just, and again, in a context where we have so much wealth and accumulation and so much capacity to eliminate poverty. And it's just heartbreaking. So, okay, then, you know, since there's a paper prompt about this, I'm just gonna remind you of this passage. and so he lays this stuff about the reserve army, the surplus populations, the more extensive, finally, the pauperized sections of the working class and the industrial reserve army, the greater is official pauperism. This is the absolute general law of the capitalist accumulation. And then, probably the question is, of course, what is this? What is that law? And the most famous section of this chapter is the next page, where he kind of talks about how the development of productivity of labor does all these horrible things to the labor. It fragments them, it alienates their intellectual potentialities, it deforms the conditions under which he works, subjects him to despotism. All methods of the production of surplus value are the same methods of accumulation, and every extension of accumulation becomes a means for the development of those methods. It follows, therefore, that in proportion as capital accumulates, the situation of the worker, be their payment high or low, must grow worse. So that's really important. Like, he's saying that as capital accumulates, the worker's situation gets worse, even if they get higher wages, right? so a lot of people said what this passage is, it's described by attackers on Marx as the immiseration thesis, which Marx argued that as capitalism develops, the workers get more miserable, basically, and workers get more immiserated. And some people have said, look, capitalism developed and workers got higher wages, so they weren't more miserable, right? But he says very clearly, it's not about wages. It's about the kind of their situation. What does that mean? And finally, this is sort of the big bells ringing. Accumulation of wealth at one pole is same time accumulation of misery, the torment of labor, slavery, ignorance, brutalization, and moral degradation at the opposite pole, on the side of the class that produces its own product of capital. So, and that is where we get to, and he talks about, ultimately how, and then he starts to talk about, like, even the political economists know that wealth requires a class of people to perform the most wearisome, the vilest, most disgusting functions. In a word, takes on the shoulders the most disagreeable and servile in life, and procures thus for other classes leisure, serenity, mind, and conventional dignity of character. So as capital accumulates, it kind of creates this necessity of having this sort of wretched class that has to do the most horrible labor in society. And it just displaces all that labor onto this sort of relation between the active and reserve army of labor. And then he ends with this great line: in poor nations, the people are comfortable. In rich nations, they are generally poor. So a lot of people that talk about going, this is, I shouldn't, it's sort of dumb, but people have noticed that in poor countries in the global south, oftentimes there's just a certain degree of community and just general content and happiness amongst people, even though they don't have a lot of stuff. But what you do find in a rich country like the United States is you have, like I was just saying, you have this utter poverty and destitution and misery for these surplus populations. And again, Philadelphia is one of the richest cities in the world, and it has within it these layers of just utterly impoverished poor people, and that's something specific to the production of wealth under capitalism. I'm just not going to spend much time with section 5. I do think it's interesting. Ultimately, he's trying to, if you do the prompt about what is the general law, I think it's useful to go through this section, because this is him showing you what the law is. And he talks about things that we now, there's huge literatures on, inequality, right? Where he talks about these economists where while the rich have been growing richer, the poor have been growing less poor. At any rate, whether the extremes of poverty are less, I do not presume to say. And he says, how lame and anticlimax. If the working classes remain poor, only less poor in proportion as it produces for the wealthy class an intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power, then it has remained relatively just as poor. If the extremes of poverty have not lessened, they have increased because the extremes of wealth have. So he's talking about inequality here. And how do we measure inequality? How do we think about inequality? If there's so much wealth, but yet still middle-class people sort of feel insecure and impoverished, is that better or what? So this is very contemporary discussion he goes into. And finally, the section on Ireland is just fascinating. And I think this formulation in particular, thinking about a relation between England and Ireland in a sort of colonial relationship, and he kind of lays out England, a preeminently industrial country with fully developed capitalist production, would have bled to death under such a population drain as Ireland suffered, but Ireland at its present is merely an agricultural district of England. So he's talking about, again, this kind of relationship between industrial and agricultural, sort of, they're just sending resources to the core countries. And he sort of talks about how Ireland's just, to be wealthy is just going to turn the whole island into a pasture, right, for provisioning raw materials to the core of England, right? So very interesting. Okay. So that is that. And I will stop share. Any questions before we take a much needed break? Right.